Yeah, so hi, welcome everyone. I have here with me Rachel McKenna and Alessandra Rossi. Maybe you quickly want to introduce yourself and your organization.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm Rachel McKenna. I'm a senior wildlife campaigner at the Environmental Investigation Agency. So EIA is an NGO that's based in the UK and in Washington, but we've got various programs of work looking at environmental crime and abuse and addressing that environmental crime and abuse through a variety of actions.
Hi everyone, my name is Alessandra Rossi and I am working and living in the Netherlands. Actually, I am working at the province of Groningen, doing something else, but at the same time I'm doing consultancy job for the United Nations Development Program, the country office of Tanzania, contributing to a project which is called tackling illegal wildlife trade and poaching through an integrated approach. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. So my first question would be, with your organizational background, what are the messages of the movie that are most important to be shared, and what could individuals contribute, and what choices of consumptions could they make for efforts in Africa?
Thanks, Mira. Yeah, so I think there's quite a lot to unpack from the film. There are quite a lot of themes, I think it's fair to say. So just trying to, I think the top kind of theme that comes out for me personally, but also as an organization, is that when we talk about illegal wildlife trade, we're not talking necessarily, as the film does portray at times, that it's purely an African problem or that it's a Chinese problem. I think what the film maybe didn't portray necessarily very clearly is that it is a global problem and the perpetrators are not limited to one specific country, they're not limited to one specific nationality, and it's a bit stereotypical, I think, the way it might have been framed. So I think that narrative is something that is quite dangerous and we do see, unfortunately, a lot in the media presented. So that's kind of my top line takeaway, I think. The second one is also I think it was in the first act about crime and corruption. The whole issue of the linkages between wildlife trafficking and terrorist finance. So while this has been a narrative that's been kind of ongoing for quite a few years, I think it started around 2015 or so, it has been debunked since by think tanks such as the Royal United Services Institute, which is a military think tank. It's been debunked by the UN. In the sense, when I say debunked, like there's obviously ad hoc evidence to support, terrorist groups maybe trading in small pieces of ivory here and there, but not to the scale that actually finances operations. It's been proved that terrorist organizations will obviously find more considerable sources of income from, say, charcoal trafficking, and this has been proved already for the likes of Al-Shabaab, who were responsible for the Westgate shopping mall attack. So the linkages that are portrayed in the film are conflated, I would say, from an organizational perspective. But it is it's a catchy narrative, but a lot more evidence and a lot more research is needed into these linkages. And in and of itself, illegal wildlife trade is a serious and organized crime form, and as such, it should be treated, seriously. It doesn't need to be linked to, say, things like terrorism for people to take it seriously. So I think those are kind of my main messages. I could go on, but I think you've got some time limits.
Yeah, maybe also to you a question. There has been talk of an integrated approach of tackling wildlife trafficking through other laws, through other treaties, also maybe linked to terrorist finance. To what extent do you think this works or has been tried? What is your experience?
Well, what I can say concerns mainly my experience in East Africa and especially in Tanzania and Uganda, where I have worked and where I am still working in Tanzania, contributing to this project. So I think it is very important that the governments, African governments, they put in place some stronger measures in order to tackle poaching and wildlife trafficking. So it is very important on one side that the poachers get a very clear message that there's a very high chance they're being caught, so that a very strong legislative system is in place, and that is policies and legislations about poaching and wildlife trafficking are actually implemented and enforced. Because one of the messages of the film, of the documentary that we have heard in this last 20 minutes, I think it was the woman of the Fish and Wildlife Services, in which they were showing all the seized items. She said a very important thing, that it's a very low risk, poaching and wildlife crime is a very low risk activity. So this is something on which all the African governments should actually focus. They are ultimately responsible of putting in place the right legislation and enforcing it. So this is very important, but it is not the only thing that can stop poaching. So that is why we are talking about integrated approaches, because you also need to tackle poaching. In this documentary, a very interesting and beautiful thing I found personally is that there are very different aspects which are shown, and that are also showing the complexity of the problem. So it is not only that by enacting and enforcing the law you can solve the problem. You need to work with the communities, you need to raise the awareness of the community at the community level, you need to put in place and to finance projects that will sustainable help the communities to raise an alternative income, so that they have an alternative to engaging in poaching. Another thing is providing technical assistance, because in the field there's very much need of committed people and rangers that are putting their life at risk every day when they go on patrol. So there's also very much need of technical assistance, capacity building, and that is the meaning of the integrated approach. You are not just tackling one issue, but you are looking at poaching and illegal wildlife trade in all aspects of both institutional organizations and society as well. So that is my brief answer to that, I hope. So brief was.
Great. Maybe on the technical assistance also, and on the different types of poaching and wildlife trafficking, what different types are they? At which markets do they end up? And maybe also challenging the issue of being discovered and of prosecuting these crimes. How does the Environmental Investigation Agency investigate those flows?
Thanks. Yeah, so illegal wildlife trade, when we talk about illegal wildlife trade, obviously we're talking about not just ivory trafficking, we're not just talking about the transnational aspects to the trade, we're also talking about aspects that we've briefly touched on at the end of the film about bushmeat trafficking. But from EIA's perspective, we don't focus on the illegal trades that remain within borders. We focus on the transnational aspect. So the markets obviously differ greatly depending on the products that you're talking about. So I can talk briefly about a project that we have ongoing in West and Central Africa, primarily in Nigeria, which has emerged as the world's largest export hub for ivory and pangolin scales that are shipped to East Asia, and not just Vietnam, not just China, but also Vietnam, and also Cambodia and Laos and other places in the region, but China and Vietnam are the predominant destinations. And that kind of, the destination markets for those, it depends on the demand for this product. So those products are usually consumed by people that will be invested in traditional Chinese medicine, for example, when it comes to pangolin scales. In the same way that rhino horn is used in traditional Chinese medicine, pangolin scales are made out of exactly the same thing as rhino horns, and they're used for the same purposes. Ivory still remains to this day one of like a status symbol product. It's used to portray like your purchasing power more than anything else. It's not used in any type of traditional medicine. It's just there to display, to show that, look, I can actually afford this, and you can't. It's more of that kind of a message. How, in terms of how EIA actually investigates, so we, as an organization, we pioneered the undercover investigation of wildlife trafficking in the 80s. And this, going back very much to basics, is just like, back in the 80s, it was just you hide in a box with a camera, and then you take undercover footage of crimes that are going on. Obviously, since then, we've kind of evolved our techniques a little bit. We conduct years-long investigations in all parts of the world. We basically infiltrate trafficking networks that goes from the sourcing kind of actors to the transit kind of actors and to the consumers. And we basically try and uncover as much raw information as possible about the actors involved, the modus operandi, the concealment methods, the routes, the buyers, and the corruption that is present all along the train. And that information essentially is packaged up and sent to government stakeholders that actually can do something about it, because we are, at the end of the day, an NGO. We don't have any enforcement powers, but we send it off to those who are mandated to actually act on it. Doesn't always happen, obviously, as you can imagine. But we share information with the likes of Interpol at the international level, but at the national level, we'll send it with law enforcement agencies in Nigeria, for example, in this instance, or in Vietnam, or in China. And one of the things that we're promoting quite heavily at the moment is the use of financial investigations, and this was a theme that was actually touched on in the film. The idea that, when you arrest someone in the act of poaching, you can get so much information other than just that ivory tusk that they've poached or they're trying to sell. You can actually uncover a lot if you undertake a financial investigation. You can actually uncover their whole network by uncovering their financial links to other people, the things they're actually buying with the money that they've got. It's usually a crime that's associated to money laundering, and so this is quite a new and emerging trend when it comes to illegal wildlife trade investigations, but it's something that's very well established for other forms of organized crime, for example, drugs or weapons in particular. But it's still relatively new territory for wildlife trafficking cases, and it's something that we're trialing at the moment in West and Central Africa.
Great, thank you. And the movie was very negative, especially towards the end, in terms of what we can still do in wildlife trade and against this trade, and in terms of conservation. Do you have some examples of treaties, of projects that actually had a positive effect?
Yeah, well, it's true that the documentary gives a very somber picture of what is happening across the African continent about the wildlife and the conservation. There are for sure many instruments, framework, treaties, agreements that are in place at the national level. If we look at the countries, African countries where I've worked, in East Africa and in Tanzania, there are quite many national frameworks, and it is very important that the government, with all the assistance of international cooperation, which is there, but it's very important that the government take responsibility of putting in place the necessary measures. So at the national level, they can focus on reviewing their legislation about poaching and wildlife trafficking and enforcing that legislation. For instance, in Tanzania, they have just approved a new national strategy on anti-poaching and illegal wildlife trafficking. So this is a national instrument. At the regional level, you can think about, there's also an anti-poaching strategy, for instance, in the East African community, And it's very important, the transnational and transboundary cooperation in poaching, because poaching is not something that stays in one country, it's transboundary by nature. So at the international level, I can mention the CITES Convention. I think the people might know what is about the Convention on International Trade of Wildlife Species of Fauna and Flora. But as about how effective they are, yeah, that is not an answer I can give, because I can say there's been quite a development in the last 10 years in East Africa, at least, and a lot has been done in terms of regional, and international frameworks. But as about the positive impact that they have had, or that they are having, or that they will have in the long term, this is a very difficult question to answer, I think. So, but in any case, the tools are in place. So I think that's important that both the governments and also the individuals and the society in general will take the responsibility to act. So that's also an important message of the documentary.
Thank you. Maybe from your organizational experience?
Yep, I think Alessandra touched on it. Sorry. Yeah, when it comes to the CITES Convention, we do quite a lot of lobbying work ahead of each of the CITES meetings. But I think, as Alessandra said, that the tools are there, they're all in place, and they're being developed at quite like a fast rate. The issue is implementation and enforcement of the convention. And I think that's probably a much wider discussion to be had about international multilateral frameworks as a whole. They're very difficult to enforce. It's a voluntary process for the most part to sign up. And at the end of the day, actually, CITES is one of the conventions that actually has compliance mechanisms attached to it, which means that if a country doesn't do what it's meant to do, technically the rest of the countries can vote to impose sanctions on that non-compliant country. It doesn't happen often because it's politically quite sensitive, obviously, but it's actually quite interesting to see that it's one of the only conventions out there that actually has that level of teeth. But it hasn't been used that often. Like very recently, Mexico was slapped with sanctions for not being able to regulate its trade protect its vaquita, which is being overfished as a direct consequence of poaching for totawaba, which is an endangered fish that's poached for its swim bladder for traditional Chinese medicine. So for many years now, CITES parties have asked Mexico to get its act together, and it hasn't. So finally, it was slapped with sanctions, and within the space of a week, the sanctions were repealed. So I mean, the sanctions exist, but I don't think they've been enforced necessarily very effectively up until now. But we still have hope.
Yeah, maybe also to touch upon some changes that have happened since the movie. It was mentioned that in China, the trade of ivory was legal at that point, but that changed in 2018, I believe. Can you maybe also tell us a bit about the recent changes, how those translated into, like, in terms of volume, in terms of profitability, and how the geographical location maybe of wildlife trade changed?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So in 2017, China announced its intention to close its domestic ivory market because, as we saw in the film, it was explained that China was a leading destination for a lot of ivory that was being poached and trafficked illegally. So before it announced its ban, it was, and the data did show that it was the leading destination. And the reason why it became the leading destination, I think, is very important for context, is that in 2008, CITES allowed a one-off sale of stockpiled ivory from a bunch of southern African countries to China. And then China's ivory carving industry essentially flourished. But then EIA conducted investigations in 2008, and they found actually that 90% of the ivory that was within China's legal carving market was actually sourced illegally from recently poached elephants. So this issue of enforcement again comes up, that it was extremely difficult to, ask a customs official to tell the difference between legally sourced ivory and illegally sourced ivory. It's very difficult to tell to the naked eye. You need very, expert material and techniques to actually tell when ivory was poached and from where it came, that kind of thing. You need to do DNA analysis on that. So China's announcement in 2017 that it was going to close its ivory market was really welcome news, and it took them a record 1 year to actually bring it into force. For context, the UK announced their ivory ban in 2018, and it only came into force last year, so it took them a good 5 years to actually get it into place. But what that means in practice, and what we've actually already seen, is that there's been already displacement in the market. So Vietnam has now taken over as one of the leading destinations for illegally sourced ivory. It still remains to be seen how much of that ivory remains within Vietnam, or if actually it's going to Vietnam to be transported over land borders into China. That's something that EIA is trying to investigate further. But with the pandemic and border closures, it's been a bit difficult to actually do that research. But I think China's domestic ivory market ban, and also that of the UK's and the EU as a whole, so the Commission announced a ban recently, it comes on the back of this really big momentum that was started by a number of African elephant range countries, so mainly West and Central African, Eastern African countries, that they actually pushed for the international community to recognize that legal ivory markets fuel poaching, and they fuel demand, and they therefore fuel trafficking. And these linkages have been shown to be true. There is evidence to support this. So there is momentum to close domestic ivory markets, and just for context, there is an international ivory ban also that has been in place since the 80s. And this is why that, if internationally it's banned, on the domestic level also it should be banned. Otherwise it's going to be this disconnect between the two, and it makes it a real enforcement headache to actually tell the difference between legal ivory and illegal ivory. So I think we're on the right track, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Maybe since we already talk about demand and the difference between international legal framework and national legal framework, what can you say about attempts to reduce demand and how those could be upscaled? Maybe both of you?
I think it is a very important consideration to think that if you have a market of something, if you have a demand, it's obvious. So one part still of the integrated approach of seeing this problem of poaching and illegal wildlife trade is that you have to tackle the demand. You have to try to change the behavior of people and try to understand why this demand is in place. So, of course, we are talking now about ivory, so we are focusing on the main demanding market for ivory, which is, let's say, Asia, China, Vietnam, and some other East Asian countries. So it is very important. Scaling up, it can involve just targeting certain countries and trying to involve also on a diplomatic level the ministers or the embassies. When I was living in Africa, in Tanzania, we were trying to reach out the Chinese embassy and the Chinese community living actually in China, because they also play a very important role in facilitating this illegal trafficking, and so we were trying also to understand what are the dynamics of the Chinese living in Tanzania, because one of the things shown in the documentary was this arrest of the Queen of Ivory, which was in Tanzania, this Chinese woman that was operating, I think, from 25 years, living in Tanzania 40 years, and she smuggled, I don't know how many tons of ivory to China. So in the time I was living there was this process because she was being prosecuted. So it is very important also to involve the community and scaling up, trying to reach the higher level of the involved countries where the major demand comes from. I don't know if Rachel has some other.
Yeah, I think you covered it. But the only thing I'd add is that I think what's really important is that we have demand reduction strategies in parallel with targeted law enforcement interventions. I think one can't really exist without the other and won't be as effective kind of solo. So that's something so EIA doesn't work on demand reduction at all. It's something that it is very well covered by the likes of WWF, WCS, and I don't know, I guess Traffic.
Is doing quite a lot of work.
Yeah.
For traffic in Tanzania. So yes, they are focusing very much on demand reduction.
Yeah, yeah, and then so that's where kind of we fill in the other side of the gap is where our approach is really to strengthen criminal justice responses to the crime itself. So our program in Nigeria is really building stronger laws, building the capacity of the judiciary, for example, to actually build up the infrastructure in place to prosecute and convict wildlife traffickers. Because, as I say, it's two sides of the same coin. You need to be able to tackle both at the same time. And I do think this is an integrated approach, if I can call it that, and it's hugely important, I think. And it's something, I think that, again, is also gaining momentum amongst the conservation / investigation community.
Thank you. We talked a lot about ivory, and it also talked a bit about rhino horn. But there are also many other types of wildlife trafficking or specific animals that are trafficked, especially into Europe. Maybe you can explain something about those flows?
Yes, well, I think the documentary, is focused on African species, but so we tend in this, the impression I got from this documentary is that, and I think most of the people here will get the impression that, the demand is in China, the problem is in China. We have to save the elephants and the rhinos because of this crazy demand for carved items or traditional medicine. But we, as Western countries, are also playing a role into wildlife trade and sometimes or often trafficking, because there are also wild species which are imported to Europe or to Western countries. And we might think that, we are not responsible of destroying nature, but we are also playing a big role. We might think about wild species that are coming into Europe and Western countries as exotic pets. So we might think about tropical birds, parrots, or lizards, various types of lizards, chameleons, newts, snakes, all those species which are imported legally into Europe, whether coming from the wild or coming from captive breedings. But you also have to think that even if the species is, so to say, legally sourced because it's coming from a captive breeding or coming from the wild, harvested from the wild, and considered as legally harvested, there is still a very big impact on nature. The conditions in which these animals are captive bred in some of the origin countries are sometimes very miserable. And you also have to consider that in the flow of trade to bring these exotic pets to Europe, for instance, I think Germany, the Netherlands are one of the major importers of tropical birds and chameleons, I think. As from the last numbers I was looking from the CITES trade database. So you might think that for 10 birds or 10 lizards alive to arrive, maybe 100 have been, are dead in transport. So there's a very high mortality rate in this trade. So this is not, it's not only China who is impacting the African or the tropical origin countries, it's also the Western world. So we are all responsible of this. So this is again one consideration to think about our consumer behavior and what we might want also as a, as pet or decoration for our homes, let's say.
You talked a bit about how many of these trafficked animals also die on the way to Europe. Maybe a bit more of a procedural question. What happens actually to animals if at the border it is of a European country it is detected that they're illegally trafficked? What is the process from then onwards?
Well, that is a difficult question because I'm not a legal expert. Maybe there's someone in the room who is a legal expert. But from what I know, for when I was working for the CITES convention authority in Italy, it's that when you are seizing wild animals, it's a very tricky process because if the species are of conservation concern, then you might find a volunteer association or zoo or wildlife park that might want to host the species. But if the species are of no conservation concern, I'm afraid that most countries will opt for destruction. So it means that the species will be euthanized. So this is also another dark side of the exotic pet trade.
Thank you very much. That concludes my questions to you. Are there questions from the audience? Yes?
Given all the resources possible, what would you do to fix the situation?
Maybe I can quickly repeat the question so that we can also hear it in the video. If you would have all the resources possible, what would you do to rectify the situation?
Yes, it's a very long list, but thank you very much for all the resources possible. I think, it's a very long list, but it will start covering all those aspects that we have mentioned. So, but if I have to mention something which is very important and very basic, I would say to change the behavior of people and to try to get them involved in conservation, because that the cultural change is what is most needed to address this issue. I don't know, Rachel, if you have a top one or two.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think from like an NGO perspective, obviously we're always running out of money, so I appreciate your offer. But I think the priority for us would be, given our focus on the international side of things with the trafficking, I think we'd be looking to build the capacity of governments in key hotspots. So for example, at the moment, our hotspot is West and Central Africa, but also Southeast Asia. So the gaps that we've identified in the capacity and the needs that they've actually identified themselves, for example, in Nigeria, we've heard basic requests, for vehicles to get from A to B, that kind of baseline that needs to be addressed still. I think there's that, but then there's more kind of technical kind of capacity building that needs to be given to, for example, as I just mentioned, the judiciary, who actually have never prosecuted a wildlife case in their careers. They don't see the importance of it, so it's kind of raising the awareness in that sense, running workshops, capacity building workshops in that sense, but not just one-off capacity building workshops, a series of them that can regularly occur. So you're actually building up a long-term system level approach. You're not just going in there, dropping in your knowledge and then leaving, because that's not going to do anyone any good.
Thanks. We had another question? Yes? Yeah, maybe I can quickly repeat the question. So what got you into, I guess, conservation, wildlife trafficking, investigation or campaigning on that issue? And also what can the ordinary consumer do against this issue?
Well, the first one, what got me into conservation is a really deep passion for an interest for animals alive, possibly. So it was really a torture for me to look at this, but yeah. And the second one, the advice is, I would say, just be very mindful of your choices as a consumer, because as we have seen here also, we are all part of this exploitation of nature, of wildlife, and very often also unaware of people turned into slaves, and because we are having all these devices and some of the things that we think we need in our daily life. So as much as possible, try to be mindful of your choices, and especially not to buy any exotic pet. That's that I would say. But it's a difficult one, or you can always decide to make a donation for one of those NGOs, but we have seen also some controversial aspects here of some NGOs in the Cameroon forest where the Baka people are living. So you are also questioning where is my money going? That's something sometimes I have when I have to decide where do I make a donation. So or I'm pretty sure that I trust that organization, or otherwise I will just try to watch my consumer choices and the linkages that it can have with wildlife exploitation.
For the first question, I got interested in this after doing my master's actually at this university. I did my master's in international security with a focus on organized crime, so I was just interested in that side of things. But then similar to Alessandra, I really love animals, and I wanted to try and combine the two somehow. And I actually came to one of these events by the illicit trade school group back in, I can't remember when it was, 2016 or something, run by Tim Wittig. And yeah, that's really what kind of got me super interested in it, and seeing actually a career could be made out of it. And your second question on what people can do kind of on a daily basis, I think the lucky thing is that we live in the EU and we actually can contribute to policy making. There are opportunities to contribute to public consultations on things like this, specifically ahead of like meetings like CITES, for example, where the EU will be deciding their position on certain illegal trade matters that if you feel strongly about, you can actually have a voice to contribute your opinion to. And those public consultations, you can find them on the EU Commission website. It is a very convoluted process, and the timeframes to actually provide input are sometimes very hit and miss. They don't advertise them very well, but I'd be happy to provide more information if that's something you're interested in, because I think that is something that more and more people should be taking advantage of, because the more people that speak out, obviously, the more these issues get heard and the more right decisions get made.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
So what I sort of really understand is part where so you also mentioned the things we have to do to make sure the law gets enforced, and you're doing research and presenting that to their government so they can do something about it or so. But then, and this is all documentary, you know, like the problem is the corruption in the government and all the headings and all that. So like how how are you as your NGO or your organization, how are you who are you communicating? Because how do you get through to do something there? Well, regarding the whole wildlife trafficking, I mean, you can say this is what we need to do, but you can present it to the government, but the government are the ones doing it, so they're how does that process go?
How do you communicate with the government and get sure that the corruption doesn't get in between or something?
Well, how do you try to go fix the problem in the country with the people who are doing
Yeah.
things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe to break the question down, who are the important people to talk to that are not corrupt themselves? Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's difficult because you will always have corrupt people, but fortunately, you also have good people. So you just have to try to do your to reach as many people as you can within the government and the institution that can that actually have the power to put in place the legislation and to enforce it. And just be hopeful that you will know when someone is corrupt. I can tell you, you will know, because as you go there as an NGO, I was also working as with this head of the NGOs, and first thing they will do, they will ask you a bribe if you're going to the corrupt ones. But there are also many committed people that will just do their job and ask for nothing. So, you have a little bit of everything, and you have to be, just to hope that you can give your message to the right people, and that there will be someone that will follow through.
Yeah, I think I was going to say exactly the same as Alessandra, and also just to add to that, I think that's why it's, you asked me how did I get into the field. I never expected it would be this frustrating as a field in general, because progress is really slow. So I think kind of you have to accept that going in, you're not going to get results overnight. You have to build relationships with government partners, and that takes a really long time. And then added to that is, governments change with every election. So you're going to have to keep building those relationships. So it's something you've got to keep at. And as Alessandra said, like, there are really good eggs also in the bunch. So you can actually get the results that you want. It just takes time. And it's all about changing perception a lot of the time to actually be taken seriously, that this is a serious issue. You kind of have to approach them in a way that is going to pique their interest. You don't come in as, for example, from an animal welfare perspective, because that's not going to get them interested at all. You actually have to tell them what's in it for them, essentially. Why is it in their interest to tackle this issue?
So then it's also kind of a lot of lobbying, or like you know the people from the government, you know you're going to pick the people that
Yeah.
are right ones
Exactly, it's strategic. Yeah, it's strategic, and that's why it can be a huge headache. But yeah, it's strategy at the end of the day to know who you're approaching. And also the thing not to forget is also like governments or countries, you know, playing the reputational card is something that can be quite influential. Like countries, if for example we want to affect change in Nigeria, let's say, we might approach foreign embassies in Nigeria that have diplomatic sway. So, for example, the British government has quite close ties with the Nigerian government. So we'll go via that route and they'll apply pressure in their way. So it's not always, for example, me just going and saying, oh, hey, could you do this? Because that doesn't often yield results. It's trying to find the right people to pass the message onto them.
Yes.
Yeah, so I feel like this documentary gave some conflicting opinions on the role of tourism. One of them being, well, go shoot animals with your camera rather than with your gun. Whereas the others more like, well, tourism causes land to be taken away from wildlife and from indigenous community for the sake of luxury resorts and safari parks. So, what would your perspective be on that? Should I book a safari tomorrow if I care about the animals, or like, what's the role of tourism? Also, a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, maybe to quickly repeat, in terms of tourism, what is your take on safari, on whether tourism is good or bad, or what effects it has?
No, I wouldn't say that it's good or bad. It's always something in between because, if you have to go for a tourist trip to Africa, then I would, of course, advise go for a safari. Maybe you can search a company where most of the revenues are going also to be reinvested in local projects and for the benefits of local communities. But the conflict with the local communities and the safari companies or the hunting trophy even more is there. That is a fact because most of these communities used to live in the wildlife areas. So if these wildlife areas are used or for trophy hunting or for photographic safari, then of course there's a conflict with the local communities. It will be there because the community are, there's this kind of disconnect between the communities and the wildlife, which was also said at a certain point in the documentary, which is true because most of the local people of the local community, they don't feel so close to the wildlife because they feel that the interests of the wildlife are dominant as compared to the interests of the people. And very often, if they are caught in poaching wildlife inside the protected areas, the penalties will be very high for them. But on the other side, they see that the rich US or European tourists are just going there hunting, for safari hunting. So this is something that makes them very angry. It's perceived as injustice. And in a certain way it is. So of course, if you want to go to Africa, I would say try to find a good safari company and enjoy a photographic safari. I wouldn't certainly recommend a trophy hunting safari because that's not, in my personal opinion, that's not a conservation. Trophy hunters are not conservationists. This is my personal opinion, but definitely not with this rate of species decline. You cannot claim that shooting the big cats and carnivores is a conservation activity. Not at all. I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, I can add. I think just very briefly, because it's not a topic that I'm familiar with, but I know there is some research or like outputs that are being published by the World Tourist Office, I think under the UN. They actually they have a whole new and evolving branch looking at environmental crime and how that impacts tourism. So I'm not sure if they'd go so far as to, provide recommendations, but there are definitely organizations that are working on these issues, and they would at least be able to tell you at minimum who you shouldn't be going with, I think. So I think that could be a starting point.
Great, thank you. Any more questions? Yes. In the back.
Well, in your beginning, the director mentioned for lack of Black Africans speaking in certain ways. And I was wondering how, as a white person, especially white people working locally in an NGO, how do you avoid becoming paternalistic, exhibiting white savior concepts that coming in and saying this is how you need to do it, we know better than you, even though there might be local knowledge already available, but because of other experiences, it's much more effective.
Yeah, so to repeat, I guess, how can you avoid being paternalistic in the work that you do, coming from the outside into local context?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's this tendency of being having this superiority attitude is quite present, because there are so many let's say cooperation programs and NGOs and basically run by white people which are present in African countries. And it is very important that you try to approach them always with respect and trying to hear them and to listen to what they have to say. Because if you are going there with this attitude, we know better, then you will not have any cooperation from their side, and then your work is completely useless. So I would say it's very important always to have respect for the local colleagues with which you're working, and at the end of the day, they are the ones that probably know better than us. So that's my point of view.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a question I get quite often, because I'm based in Groningen and I'm researching crimes that happen in West and Central Africa. And I completely get that question. And I think from EIA's perspective, we don't have any in-country offices, but we have only 2 offices, one in London and one in Washington. But the reason being is that we actually partner up with local civil society organizations in our target countries. And the idea being that we don't by any means think that we're there to impart our knowledge and they should take it on board. It's a 2-way process that we learn from them and they learn from us. And it's proven to be quite a good, or a fruitful kind of partnership strategy. At the moment, we work with a local organization called Africa Nature Investors in Nigeria. And we've got a load of other partners in Cameroon, and we're expanding our network in Gabon at the moment. But we never go in country without actually consulting with local organizations that do similar work to us, because we firmly believe that actually, at the end of the day, ideally, we wouldn't exist as an organization. It would be led from national and local efforts rather than international efforts. But it has been tricky, understandably, that as an organization, sometimes EIA can be the target of, some questions like, who are you to come in and tell us to do it a certain way? But then I think the strength there is actually that when the message is actually, our messages are being repeated by local civil society organizations, I think that actually hits home a bit harder. And so it's really all about combining forces, I think, and not going at it alone. which is not something that EI has ever really done.
Thank you. Who had another question? Yes.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. So the documentary, what I found really interesting was the part where the Baka people were really upset about the conservationists coming in and kind of like pushing them out. So I was wondering, as a conservation organization, are there any rules or laws that kind of also protect land and people? Or can I just gather money and with best intentions go there and ruin it up? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, on a local context. Can I quickly repeat this? Thanks. On a local context, I guess, what are the frameworks and policies in place for people coming in, NGOs, organizations, to operate there?
I don't really know about NGOs. Maybe Rachel can take that one, because when I was working there for Traffic was also an NGO. We didn't really much address this problem, because as an NGO that is working against poaching and wildlife trafficking, you are assuming that everything what you're doing is according, of course, to the national legislation to which you have to abide, so that you are assuming that is enough. But right now, when I am contributing to this United Nations Development Program project in Tanzania, the UN, specifically for that case of the Baka people and some other similar situation might have occurred, I think, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the UN agencies, they have in place a sort of safeguard mechanism to assess the social and environmental impacts of any project which is funded with the United Nations Development Program or any other UN program project needs to be screened for this, for respecting this safeguard mechanism and protocol, based on which you are going to assess the impacts on all levels that your project will bring about towards the environment and the local communities. So you are not assuming that your project is good just by itself. You're going to test it and to engage independent consultants that will make a social and environmental impact assessment and screening. I don't know if you have more protocols or things.
Yeah, it's very similar, I think, in the NGO sector at least. So we have our own internal safeguarding policies, similar to what Alessandra mentioned, and that's modeled very much on UK charity regulations. So there is a framework that kind of, as a charity, if you register as a charity, especially doing this kind of work, you sign up and you commit to not doing certain things. So there's that aspect of it. And then also, as Alessandra said, whenever we go in country, we always abide by national legislation and also international conventions on human rights violations, etc. So there are these frameworks in place. But yeah, I think probably that's a question. I think, for example, with EIA, we don't necessarily work very much with indigenous populations such as the Baka. I personally don't think EIA has any programs of work in, maybe our forestry section actually might do something similar. But we definitely have safeguarding policies in place internally. And also because as an NGO, we're funded by donors, especially like institutional donors. They all have their requirements also for us on how we operate in countries. So they'll double check our activities, our proposed activities, and they'll make sure that, you know, we sign up to committing to best practice, essentially.
Yeah, maybe there's something I can add to this. Would the framework that is increasingly being used is often so-called license to operate, and I'm not sure to what extent it has that name in the NGO sector, but for example in the building sector or for big projects, this license to operate is increasingly being used to also assess what local communities think about the project, whether they oppose it, what the local community thinks about it. We have time for one last question. Yes?
I wanted to ask, you mentioned that cultural shift is one of the important aspects for there to be somewhat permanent resolution. I wanted to ask if there's any work being done to target this kind of thing, especially by the local system, like the UCP.
Could you repeat the last part?
If there's any work being done to target this kind of cultural shift, especially by the locals, since that would be probably received better.
Yeah, I guess on the local level, what is being done in terms of changing cultural perceptions, changing the idea, the behavior on wildlife trafficking?
Yeah, I think one very important thing is always to try to put in place specific projects which are involving the local communities and are trying to bring the communities to see the value of wildlife, because as we have seen, there's this disconnect between what is the benefit and the value that wildlife can bring to the community. Because at the very moment, in many areas in Africa, elephants are more a pest than a value. So the important thing is to change their perception of the wildlife and into monetary terms, because many of these communities are still struggling with poverty, subsistence, and actually having having enough to feed their children. So I mean, if you don't create a value for wildlife, then there's also no motivation and no reason for them to protect them. So what I think is very effective is to establish small-scale projects at the local level, local community level. So there are funds for many cooperation programs and UN programs, and part of these funds can, and it is actually right now in this project I'm following, invested into putting in place these small-scale projects in which the communities can create actually an economic activity out of protecting the wildlife. We have one of these projects is trying to build capacity and train also women rangers or wildlife scout that can help to detect poaching activities and to communicate this information to the wildlife services. So, and when a project with some kind of money and finance is going to a community with this purpose, then there will also be a shift in the way in which they perceive the wildlife and in which they value the wildlife.
Yeah, I think actually you covered it. I think it links back to the question that we had earlier about demand reduction strategies and behavioral changing consumer behavior. There are initiatives in place, as Alessandra mentioned. It's not something EIA works on, so I can't say more than that, unfortunately.
Great, thank you so much. So that concludes our panel. I hope you enjoyed it. I found it very interesting to hear your perspectives on it.
It was indeed very interesting
And
very insightful.
yeah, and we do have some small presents for you because you volunteered to come here on your own time.
Yeah.